Uh, Hi there. I hope that you're doing well. This is Act Two, All's Well That Ends Well, by William Shakespeare, and it's a sunny day in Atlanta, which is totally irrelevant. But anyway, let's keep going. Act Two. Let's see what we're gonna do. What happens in Act Two? Well, ooh, my head is in the way. Wonder if I can sort of go there. Well, let's just go there for now. This scene mostly takes place in Paris. So remember at the end of Act 1, basically Act 1 we were in Roussillon mostly. We did see the king a bit. But now we're up in Paris, and at the end of Act 1, as you'll remember, Helen was about to go to Paris to try to cure the king of his ulcer, because she's got mad medical knowledge from her late father, Gerard de Narbon. So scene 1, we're in Paris. The king, this is before Helen shows up. The king says bye-bye to some of the courtiers who are going to the, whatever the fight is. This is probably a squabble between, well, it is, isn't it? It's a squabble between Florence and Siena in Tuscany. And so he says bye to those soldiers. He has told Bertram to stay because he's young and inexperienced. And I suppose the king's just looking after Bertram, but Bertram's not very happy about that and has a bit of a hissy fit later in the scene. LeFou shows up. Lord LeFou, remember him from Act 1, and he, you've probably realised by now, really, really likes Helen, and just thinks she's terrific in every way, which again is quite interesting in terms of this class thing that we keep, the social class aspect that we've been talking about in the play. Here's a lord. He knows she's not aristocracy, but he kind of bigs her up anyway. And here he pretty much sells her to the king. The king has given up on medical treatment he's obviously had a number of doctors who say they're going to treat him, who have tried to treat him, and the king has said, he's given up essentially at this point, and LeFou really has to convince him to work with Helen. I think the king is intrigued that it's a woman, but even after LeFou's introduction, when Helen shows up, she really has to convince him that he should bother with this treatment, and she says that within 2 days she'll cure him. She makes a deal with him. The deal is that if she cures him, she will... Well, let's go the other way around. She says, if I don't cure you, then you can call me out, you can call me names, you can essentially, and it's this theme of women again in the play, she essentially says you can call me a kind of unclean woman, you can call me a strumpet, you can essentially besmirch my reputation publicly, which is a pretty big deal for a woman to say in this time and place. And then the king says, okay, well, what if you do cure me? And she says, well, I would like you to, I'd like to have any husband I choose. She's quite smart here, which we'll talk about in a minute. But that's the deal that they make. Okay, so scene 2, we go back to Roussillon, and the Countess and the Fool exchange some banter, and she sends a letter to Helen. Once you've read this whole play, you'll realise the play kind of is propelled by a number of letters that are sent between different people, which I always think you see that in a lot of literature, like the plot standing or falling on a letter that was sent, or a letter that was sent but that was never received. That's kind of a favourite of one of my favourite authors, Thomas Hardy. Some people who tragically don't receive letters that were sent. But you could say that kind of miscommunication goes all the way back to Greek tragedy, and people not knowing that something has happened, some key piece of information. Anyway, scene 3, Paris. Must be a couple of days later because the king shows up. Imagine a production of this. Early scenes, he might have been holding his side or his stomach where the ulcer was. Now he's totally cured, and he absolutely follows through. Sorry about that. He follows through on his end of the deal. Of course, she picks Bertram. Bertram is not happy about it at all, but the king actually gets pretty angry and says, look, I don't break my deals, my promises. So you need to marry her. And he comes down hard on Bertram, who is pretty whiny about it. I mean, I suppose you could have it's understandable that he's blindsided by it. But he's surprisingly feisty back at the king. One of his lines is something like, you're bringing me down so that you can pick yourself up. Well, now that you're up, you can bring me down. Sounds very sort of, adolescent to me. And I think you're supposed to feel maybe that way about Bertram. This is quite a long scene, scene 3. Everybody leaves after that happens except Parole and LeFou. LeFou insults Parole. This is where we really start seeing that the other courtiers think that Parole is kind of a joke and a bit of a braggart, and they don't like him. They think that he's got airs and graces above his station. Parole and Bertram then plan to run off. Bertram doesn't want to be married to Helen, so he says, let's just run off to Italy and we'll fight. And Parole's not very happy either because of his treatment from LeFou, so both of them feel motivated to leave. Scene 4, Paris. Again, Helena receives the letter that, was sent at the end of scene 2 from the Countess. And that letter didn't say much more than, how are you doing? Some other letters are more important in the play. Paroles shows up. We know that he quite likes Helena, from Act 1, Scene 1 already, with their banter there. But he pretty much turns up to tell as a messenger boy for Bertram, and he tells Helena that he and Bertram are going to Italy, and he gives her Bertram's instructions, which essentially is, go back to Roussillon, I'm off to Italy, I'm not going to go to bed with you, and that's it. Scene 5 is also in Paris. LeFou talks to Bertram about Parole and says, you don't really like that guy, do you? So it's a sort of follow-up on scene 3. Bertram kind of argues for Parole. He's not sure now that LeFou, a trusted courtier, is saying this to him. Anyway, then Helena enters. Bertram tells her to go back to Roussillon. And it's all a bit sad for us, I think, because we quite like Helena, or I quite like her at this point, and we feel like he's being pretty tough on her. He has a little speech at the end where he says, well, you might not understand what I'm doing, but perhaps it'll make sense one day, but, does he really mean that? Don't know. He says, I have to move my head here, go thou toward home, where I will never come, whilst I can shake my sword, or hear the drum. And of course she's not on stage when he says that. How does he say those lines? Is he kind of, I don't care about you at all, and I want you out of here? Or, as in the Globe production, which perhaps some of you have seen already, which you can download from their website, does he say, does he have a sort of wistfulness about it? In that production, by the way, if you have seen it, almost as soon as the king has told off Bertram has this kind of... You get the feeling that he's regretful, or increasingly regretful, over his kind of feistiness with the king, and you get the feeling he's sort of slowly thinking, maybe I do like her actually. Maybe it's just this whole rigid class structure thing that has made me not even consider her, right? So I wonder what you think about that. 3 more slides to go through with you. Let's talk about Helena. 2 different Helenas up here. This one is, I think, the Royal Shakespeare Company, and I don't know the name of the actress, sorry. That's a fairly recent product. Both of these are fairly recent productions. And this one is the American Shakespeare Company, I think they're called. They're in Staunton, Virginia, in America. So, I don't know, which do you prefer? This, and of course, I suppose it depends which point of the play I got these images from. But this one, she seems kind of nervy, worried, a little bit like, oh, this is above my station. You can almost see her pleading with the king here. Whereas here, there's a kind of, I mean, I don't think she should be mischievous, but there's a kind of energy to her, a kind of feistiness, a kind of self-confidence that I think is quite interesting. So which one do you prefer? Think about that. So Helena, obviously she's the main character of the play, I would say. In this act, her plan plays out. She travels to Paris. She convinces the king to take her help. And she's awarded the prize she desires, Bertram. But that doesn't go very well. And we've got to wonder, how must she feel? Apart from, what did I do at the end of this act? What's she going to do? We really feel like she's a good-hearted person. I mean, Shakespeare, I don't think there's any different read of this. Maybe you can see her as manipulative, which does seem like a negative characteristic. There must be a positive version of manipulative where she's smart, she knows what she wants, and she goes and gets it. Is it okay to get someone to marry you even though they don't want to? That's an interesting ethical question. But other characters really like her. Like the Countess clearly really loves her, thinks of her as a mother. Countess thinks of herself as a mother figure. LeFou just adores her, and he's pretty much the guy who gets her the gig with the king. LeFou says, here's a good line, she is one that in her sex, her years, profession, wisdom and constancy has amazed me more than I dare blame my weakness. There's almost a bit of sort of attraction there with LeFou too. He says this a couple of times that, if I was a younger man, which I know some of you in my class thought was creepy, but I think he's just saying she's really nice, and if we were the same age. Clever. She knows just what to say to the king, and when. So maybe instead of manipulative, you can just say she's smart, she's an opportunist. And she actually convinces him by saying, look, it's not about me, it's about God. Like, God is working through me. Whereas back in Act 1, she'd said to herself, people who sit around waiting for God to help them, actually, we can help ourselves. Which sounds really modern, doesn't it? I mean, it sounds like somebody saying, you can make of yourself what you want. It's up to you to try hard, right? And that was back in Act 1. I don't have my book with me, which is very bad of me. But I think that's towards the end of Act 1 she says that. So she pretty much just switches her argument as she needs to now with the king. She also, this is another clever thing she does, she also says, hey, let me marry anyone except But you don't have to. But I'm not going to pick any of your kids, any of your sons. No one of royal blood, which is quite smart. She's thinking, well, what if he says no because I might marry one of his kids? So that's Helena. Let's talk about Shakespeare. Shakespeare's writing, he's obviously very famous for his supple use of English. There's the very famous picture of him. That's at the beginning of the first folio, which is a book we'll talk about in a minute, by, I think, a Dutch artist called Droeshout. I probably completely massacred that pronunciation, but it's one of the few pictures we have of him that may be, done with some authority. Anyway, let's talk about Shakespeare's lines. They're mostly written in poetry. The breakdown of all his dramatic writing is, and I forgot to update this slide brilliantly before I presented this, but those are about right. Blank verse is 65%, rhyming verse is 7%, and prose is 28%. Now, the proportions of these vary by play, and actually, in this play, I would guess that the rhyming verse is more and the blank verse is less. The prose is about right. Iambic pentameter, by the way, I should have said this, but blank verse is iambic pentameter with no rhyme. In other words, it's usually 10-syllable lines. 5 of those syllables are stressed. So look at this example. You haven't kissed me since we got engaged. That is one line. It's not from a Shakespeare play, but a friend of mine told me he heard that once in a cafeteria and he wanted to stand up and say, "That's a perfect iambic pentameter." By the way, an iamb, I-A-M-B, is a 2-syllable unit. The first syllable is unstressed. The second syllable is stressed. So an English word that is iambic would be between. You don't say between, you say between. There actually aren't that many 2-syllable words that are iambic, but Shakespeare and many other writers string them together, like monosyllables together, 1-syllable words, so that you get this iambic pattern. Da-dum, 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 da-dum. And of course it's not as robotic as that. It's usually much more supple, fluid, and he'll change it up pretty often. But anyway, 10-syllable lines, they don't rhyme, that's blank verse. In this play, though, this is the final bullet point, there's lots and lots of rhyming verse, particularly, in fact, the most extensive use of that is rhyming couplets. So those are two lines which rhyme with each other. So if you know what I mean by rhyme scheme, it's A, B, B, C, C, D, D, and so on. So the first rhyme rhymes with the second line, and the third line rhymes with the fourth line, and so on. And you see that a lot in this play, and you probably noticed that. That doesn't happen very often in Shakespeare's plays. It does happen occasionally in other plays, like at the end of a scene, because you can kind of hear it in the audience. You're like, oh, that's the end of the scene with this rhyme. And it's usually a moment of climax, Here's an example. Thou this to hazard needs must intimate, skill intimate, skill infinite, or monstrous desperate. There's actually a bit of an internal rhyme there as well with infinite and intimate. Internal rhyme is when a word inside the line rhymes with the rhymes at the end or somewhere else. Actually, rap uses a lot of internal rhyme, in case you're kind of intrigued by internal rhyme. So the question is, why does Shakespeare use all these rhyming couplets? And one critical take on this is that there's something sort of nursery rhymey or magical or fantastical, and so it makes us think, is this realistic? What's happening in this play? one of the editions of the play I have, which I think is the New Cambridge edition, suggests that every time you see the couplets, something sort of dreamlike or magical or unrealistic is happening. So when Helen convinces the king to go with her as doctor, that's when all the couplets start happening. Maybe Shakespeare's saying, yeah, this wouldn't normally happen, but just go with it, dream a little bit. There's a really special moment that's coming up in Act 3. There's another letter. We've been talking about letters. Helen sends a letter to the Countess, and it's actually a really sad letter in Act 3, Scene 4. And if you look closely, you'll see that it's a sonnet. So it's a 14-line letter with the rhyme scheme A, B, A, B, C, D, C, D, E, F, E, F, G, G. So a perfect Shakespearean sonnet. Well, we'll see that when we get to it. So that was Shakespeare's writing. And finally, and I feel like I've gone over in terms of time here, but I want you to... This is a little bit more about the rhyming thing and the king. Not sure where to put my head. Let's just put me in the middle. Or no, let's put me over here for now. You're looking at the first folio edition of the play, which is the only edition we have of the play. And you see it looks a little bit different, right? So right here, that looks like FT, that looks like frumpets, but actually it's strumpet. That's called a long S. That thing that looks like an F, and it's just a printing convention. At that time, they just printed S's, usually during words. Look up here, that's derst. That as this kind of F-looking. It's not quite the same as an F. It's only got a little cross in the middle. But that's boldness, not boldness. If you read it with F's, it sounds like you have a lisp. Of trumpet's boldness, a divulged fame traduced. You see what I mean? Anyway, this is what I was just talking about, and I'm not going to spend too much time on it, but it's the king and Helena in this bit where he sort of agrees to for her to be his doctor. Maybe it's unrealistic and it all gets kind of rhymey and you get these couplets. And he says, thy life is dear, for all that life can rate, worth name of life in thee hath estimate. Youth, beauty, wisdom, courage, all that happiness and prime can happy call. I mean, he says, you look so happy, so beautiful, so young. Why would you want to risk that by not treating me, by failing to treat me, and then, the bad part of the deal falling on you? It's interesting then when the king gets angry at Bertram, you're not going to see any of that couplet stuff. It's traditional blank verse, as if to say, this is real. This is real anger. This isn't dreamland, la la land. This is real. And he's pretty tough on Bertram. He says over here, it is in us, that's the royal we, right? It is in us to plant thine honour, where we please to have it grow. I tell you when and where to be honourable. Not you little pipsqueak, essentially. Check thy contempt. Check your contempt at the door. Stop your contempt. Obey our will, which travails, which works in your good. I'm working for you, essentially. Or I'm putting things into practice that are working for you. Believe not thy disdain, but presently do thine own fortunes that obedient right which both thy duty owes and our power claims. Or I will throw thee from my care for ever. See that U there is a V, V's and U's are switched. Into the staggers and the careless lapse of youth and ignorance. Both my revenge and hate loosing upon thee in the name of justice without all terms of pity. Speak thine answer. Though there's only one answer after that kind of diss, which is, yeah, I'll do whatever you say. And of course Bertram says, pardon my gracious lord, for I submit to you.
Well, I hope that was helpful. Sorry that was a bit of a long one, but lots of interesting things in Act 2. Take care. Bye.